I don't buy into the theory that women can have it all.
Oh boy.
Sorry. Like, you ask women to rate themselves? Oof. Girl, you're delusional.
I think the scientific term for that is called hoflation.
Hoflation? 6'2", $150,000 a year.
Joy Reid losing her job. I don't like celebrating people losing their jobs.
I do.
How flawlessly this campaign was run.
If you say something like that, you're not just partisan, you are bad at your job.
Biden border crisis. For the first 2 years, it was, it's not happening. And then it became,
What are they not getting?
there's massive resentment among the American people.
What is a high quality man and a woman? Can you
Women and men were treated like they were exactly the same. And I think that messed up a lot of women.
Did that mess you up?
It did.
How did it mess you up?
We got deep.
Oh, conservatism is the family values party and all of that.
Yeah, I think I'm out. I don't think this is for me. So all these DoorDash drivers are probably sending almost every single dollar they make back to the cartels in Mexico.
I don't know, man. Like, I have such a hard time thinking about it.
You've been hoodwinked. Disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal. Russia invades Ukraine. Massive immigration. Massive inflation. Housing crisis. You have failed. And so now we're going to...
I moved to DC almost a decade ago.
Really?
Yeah. And well, you were one of the first people I started working with.
That's crazy.
You were the media reporter, and you had the beat up on all things resistance media circa Trump 2016.
Yeah.
How's that industry, whose main job was to push back against Trump, different this time?
Well, that time it was all about Russian collusion.
Mm-hmm.
That was sort of the overarching narrative about Trump. And all of these media outlets really bought into the idea that the Steele dossier was real, that the FBI was going to indict him, he was going to get impeached and removed from office. And the landscape has shifted so much because Trump's really popular both among the American people and in the culture now. And there's no overarching scandal now because all of the legal cases against him have effectively been wrapped up and completed. So I don't think they have any one narrative that they're coalescing around, and that's left them fractured, confused, ineffective with their messaging. And they've lost a lot of subscribers, both from conservatives who no longer trust them because of all of the lies that they peddled the first time around. But they've also lost a lot of liberal subscribers, I assume because they were repeatedly told by these people that first, Trump was never going to make it through the entire first term. Then after he lost in 2020, that the big lie, as they called it, the idea that there was massive voter fraud in the election, was going to kill his future political career. Then following that, when he runs for re-election again in 2024, that he was going to go to prison before he ever made it to Election Day. And then when Kamala Harris takes over the Democratic ticket, Trump's going to lose to Kamala Harris. So there's no shot that Trump's ever going to be president again.
Yeah.
He wasn't even supposed to be president the first time. They viewed him as illegitimate. So if you're a liberal reader of one of those newspapers or corporate media outlets, you've been hoodwinked, essentially, half a dozen times. At a certain point, you're going to say, hey, guys, like, I agree with you on all of these issues. I also think Trump is a threat to democracy, evil, going to start World War III, whatever it is. But he hasn't been stopped yet. And in fact, he's more popular than ever. At what point do I step away from you because you have given me this false hope?
The black and white contrast is so obvious because while you were at Caller first time and I was with you, the ratings of CNN and MSNBC were through the roofs because of all things being resistance lib media. And this time around, the year started with Joy Reid losing her job. What'd you make of that?
I don't think that the Joy Reid firing was as significant as people made it out to be, because this is a network that still has Simone Sanders and Jen Psaki on the payroll. And I don't think she offered anything that significantly different than what the Biden talking heads were doing. I mean, yes, she was really bought in on identity politics, but so are all the other MSNBC hosts. Maybe you could argue that she was uniquely toxic.
So you think her product was bad? Like, why do you think she got fired in general?
I don't think her ratings were that good.
So her product was bad.
Yeah, I think her product was bad. But it is interesting to see CNN try to move back to the middle because CNN and MSNBC were pretty indistinguishable from 2016 to 2022. And now they're trying out this big panel show on Abby Phillips's primetime program where they have Scott Jennings and sometimes David Urban, Sir Michael Singleton as the conservative pushback voice. And then on Caitlin Collins' show, I mean, she's interviewing Republicans pretty much on a nightly basis. So it's almost like they're trying to get back to the pre-2015 days. Yeah. But I just think that the trust has been diminished so much in CNN that they can't just run back to the middle and suddenly regain the viewership that they lost.
Unlike the CNN point of view, yeah, I mean, I like to give credit where it's due, and unless you are making a beeper joke, I think CNN is kind of trying to claw back to the center. Going back to Joy Reid, because I was basically going through all her footage, which went viral during the first year. You know, like, I don't like celebrating people losing their jobs.
I do. Yeah. I mean, I can because I've lost jobs because of the left. So yeah. For me, it's like just desserts.
And I'm pretty sure she'll be fine, and she has made enough money in her life. However, like when you see the level of gloat and the level of 2016 pomp she had, you kind of sort of have to feel like a little karmic justice. However, when the election results came out 2 months ago, she said something which was like, Kamala ran a flawless campaign. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking about it, is that if you say something like that, you're not just partisan, you are bad at your job. I have friends who are in tech and media, who are like away from capital J journalism. Even they understood the fact that she did not run a good campaign. If you had to break down the illusion of how journalists in the city, in New York, in LA, viewed all things Kamala elite campaign vibe check, how would you describe that?
Well, I always question this because I don't know how much they actually believed it or they felt that they had to say it because they view their job as being an extension of the Democratic Party and stopping Republicans and specifically Trump from getting power. So did Joy Reid really think Kamala ran a flawless campaign? I'm not sure. But I think it's important here to kind of contextualize how journalism got to the spot that it's in today. Because if you go back to the late 1800s to early 1900s, journalism in America was an extension of political parties. Newspapers were created by political parties as messaging tools. So you had papers that were for the Whig Party or for the Democratic Party or whichever party you're talking about at the time. And it wasn't until the early to mid 1900s that the idea of objectivity came into play. It's also around that time that journalism moved away from a working class trade of people who, you know, maybe didn't have the labor skills to work in manual labor, and they weren't really smart enough to go to college because that was a really rare thing in those days. A lot of those people became journalists. And then when the idea of objectivity came along, there was this idea that in order to be objective, you had to be trained in how to do that. So you get the journalism schools, you get journalism degrees in universities. And over time, what that led to was the most elite people in American society becoming journalists. So they became increasingly divorced from the American public. Now you see that people who work at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal have educational levels on par with United States senators and Supreme Court justices, which is like not to say that it's necessarily a bad thing to be educated, but when those people live primarily in coastal cities, they're usually far less religious than the average American, make a lot more money. They tend to come from parents who are white collar. They have fewer children. You can see that there's this built-in disconnect between the average reality that, you know, Americans are living on a day-to-day basis versus the reality of a journalist working at one of these large corporate papers.
That's a really good segue to talk about your come up in journalism and how that was different from all of that. I mean, you obviously went to Georgetown. However, your background is different from most kids who graduate from Georgetown.
Yeah, so I grew up the kid of working class parents. My mom was a video store manager.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
she worked about your dad. Yeah.
She worked at a place called Errol's, which was pre-Blockbuster.
Yeah, back in my day.
Yeah. So it's really funny. We have all of these like old movie posters from when new movies would come out, or I mean, we have a wall of VHS tapes in our basement. When I was born, she left her job to be a stay-at-home mom, and my dad had gone through trade school and was a plumber. So he was a plumber his entire life, worked in, I guess you would call it like corporate plumbing, as opposed to, he didn't
What's
do like
corporate plumbing?
he didn't do like homes,
Oh,
like
okay.
people's houses. He would do like side
office.
work on
Okay,
it.
yeah.
Offices,
Yeah.
and he worked on like Nationals Park and things like that through like a larger company. So for me growing up, like it was my dream to go to college and get like a really high paying job because I wanted to like get out, I guess,
Yeah.
but also be able to give back to my family someday and be able to support my parents when they got older. And so I got into Georgetown and was like a fish out of water. It was such a strange experience. And you could just tell by like the way kids dressed, the way they talked, the things
Yeah.
that they wanted to do. Like there were so many times in college where my friends would be like, "Oh, we're gonna go to this place for brunch tomorrow," and I'm like, "I can't afford to do that, but you guys have fun." Or I'll like come and I'll just drink water.
Yeah.
I would like sneak beers into bars in my purse and then like pour them into empty
Yeah,
glasses
that's
because I couldn't afford to drink out. And then so I actually wanted to be in math. That was my first major. I wanted to do actuarial science because for two reasons. Good paycheck, really stable job prospects.
Nice.
Turns out I'm not that good at math. And so I changed my major halfway through to government and economics was like thrown in there to have some sort of
Balance, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because like everybody at Georgetown does something with government or
Has
political
a pulse on degree
science.
somehow,
And then as I got closer to graduation, I was kind of looking around for a job. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to do economic research and wasn't really having that much luck. So I started just applying to anything kind of vaguely conservative because I was really involved in college Republicans in undergrad, and ended up getting offers from media companies to come be a journalist.
Before we get into the job
Yeah.
part of it, in college, while in Georgetown, what was your reality check regarding, oh, this is the Georgetown way of thinking?
Oh, it was so quick. It was freshman year. We were on a mixed gender floor of a dorm room.
Awesome.
So
Sick.
yeah,
Yeah.
there it was like different hallways,
Of course,
but
yeah.
you would have a hallway for girls and a hallway for boys. And it was during the Obama re-election campaign against Mitt Romney. This was fall of 2012. I was the only Mitt Romney supporter on my
boy.
entire floor. But it's also funny because now Mitt Romney, I roll my eyes. But I had a Mitt Romney sign up on my door because I saw all these other Obama signs. And I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to do the Mitt Romney sign just to show that there's other people, something different. And people would come by and like rip my Mitt Romney sign down or put graffiti on my door. But the funniest was when I wanted to start a gun club with my friend, and we were going to do a gun safety club, and we were going to call it GUFA
Nice.
because Georgetown loves acronyms. So it's Georgetown University Firearms Association.
Awesome, yeah.
And I drew this sign on my whiteboard for people to sign up, and I put an AR-15 on it. And I got reported to the RA for creating an unsafe environment for the other people on my dorm room floor. So I was furious. So I went around the dorm and I took pictures of all of the crazy things on whiteboards that people were writing, curse words. I mean, there was actually a drawing that someone had made of the two RAs. One was a girl, one was a boy. Fornicating.
Fornicating, nice. PG, okay.
So I took, trying to keep it clean. So I took pictures of all these and I sent them back to the RA.
Yeah.
And I was like, hey, if you want to escalate this and explain why you're violating my free speech rights, then you're going to have to explain why you haven't reached out to any of these other people with these, lewd messages on their whiteboards first. And he just replied, touche. So the sign stayed up.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
That was a win.
Yeah.
However, that was a good reminder of like the land you're in.
I had no friends freshman year. And I made like a few friends in my Spanish class because I think they didn't really know that I was considered toxic. So they were my only.
But eventually you wanted friends, so you wanted to get a job in conservative media. So let's bring it up to speed. Like how was the job hunt in DC after you graduated?
Well, it was interesting because there's only 4, 5 conservative think
In
tanks
the city, yeah.
So if you want to do economic research, like you apply to Heritage,
Federalist,
AEI, Cato, any of those. And then I was applying for a few government jobs, but you don't hear from those for like 6 months after you apply. So I was getting close to the deadline. I really didn't want to move home with my parents. And I ended up getting 2 offers, one from Daily Caller News Foundation to be a fellow,
Yeah.
and one from Campus Reform. And I decided to go with the Campus Reform offer because Leadership Institute has these training seminars that they put on for employees for media training, like campaign school. And I thought it'd be a good way to both have a paycheck but also learn a little bit about the industry.
Yeah.
And I figured if I don't like it, I can always leave after a year and go somewhere else. But at least in that time frame, I'm making money so I can pay off my student loans.
Yeah.
And I ended up falling in love with it and sticking around.
That time was so fascinating because I had just moved to DC after Trump's election, and that if you were in DC during 2016, it felt like after the election night, it was like 9/11 basically. It was like, what the fuck just happened? However, this time it didn't feel that, I don't know, like weird, I guess. I don't know what you're going to call it. How would you kind of draw the contrast of what the media elite circle reaction was and how it was different from 2016?
I mean, it was apoplectic the first time.
Yeah.
And I mean, you remember this if you were in DC at the time. There were massive riots
Yeah.
on Inauguration Day trying to prevent Trump from even getting to the White House to do a
The
swearing
not my
in.
president
Or,
ones. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so when I was at Campus Reform, I was mostly covering higher education.
Mm-hmm.
But when I saw that the riots were going to happen, I thought I should probably go cover this. This seems like it's going to be a pretty significant historical moment. And I remember live streaming from the Campus Reform Facebook page, and then someone like ripped a stop sign out of the ground and swung it at a police officer. And then that person got pepper sprayed, and you could see the stream of pepper spray, like the orange pepper spray on the camera, my phone that I was holding up. And I was like, yeah, I think I'm out. I don't think this is for me. Needless to say, I was not part of the riot squad.
Yeah, no.
At Daily Caller years later. But it was genuinely insane.
Yeah.
I mean, you had Black Bloc, Antifa, all BLM. Like everybody was in DC for that protest / riot. And then things were quiet in 2024.
Like this time it was so mellow because a lot of people have now found out that not just the media in general, however, like the Biden admin in general knew that there might be a popular vote loss. However, they were not ready to concede that. I was talking to Sagar a couple of days ago, and he basically brought up the point that DC this time around was ready for this in a way they were not in 2016. And maybe that happened because of like all things vibe shift and whatever that came up with. What do you make of all the vibe shift narrative in general?
I think it's 2 main factors. One is that Trump was such an anomaly from the political class in America his first time around. I mean, he was saying things that a lot of people thought but would not vocalize for fear of backlash. And on the political level, things that were totally outside of the Overton window. Like the idea of doing deportations at all, of doing any immigration plan without mass asylum, the idea of like wrapping up forever wars, these things were all considered genuinely insane from both the Democrat and Republican establishment class. I think people started to get used to those ideas over the past 8 years. They started to become more normalized and, frankly, more popular among public sentiment. And then the second thing is that the 4 years of Biden were so much worse than anyone anticipated. I mean, besides some of us who follow this on a daily basis, kind of realized how dangerous some of these proposals would be. I think most people voted for Biden because they wanted a return to normalcy. They thought that things would settle down. They were a bit weary of the constant Trump news cycle. And then they realized after the first year or so, we have this disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal that leaves America humiliated on the world stage. Russia invades Ukraine for a second time. You have massive immigration, beautiful young women being murdered by illegal immigrants. You have massive inflation, where grocery prices and everyday goods are becoming quickly very unaffordable. Housing crisis with major shortages driving up rents, home prices, interest rates are super high. and things were just really genuinely chaotic, even though you had sleepy Joe Biden in the Oval Office. And the fact that things were so bad made the idea of Trump returning whatever baggage he might have had seem way more appealing than it did in 2016, even for people who weren't originally on the sort of blow up the system train.
Yeah, I mean, all those line items are like super analytical and true. In my friend circle who are not that in tune with politics, for them it was like there's this malaise. There's this like, I don't know, like this lethargy regarding building new companies, getting into tech, getting into, I don't know, like just making American economy work. They wanted to get out of that. But moving back to journalism, I want to talk about the White House Correspondents Association, and which is where you've spent a lot of days. Let's talk about that shakeup a little bit. Can you explain, because this seems super insider baseball to people outside the city, explain how the WHCA works?
Okay, so what a lot of people don't know about the White House Correspondents Association is that while the White House is in charge of actually giving people hard passes, is what they're called, which means you have a press badge that you can scan to get on the White House campus. That's controlled by the White House, whatever administration is in charge, and Secret Service. But the WHCA controls the briefing room and the press pool, which are really the golden tickets for access to the president and the administration.
So briefing room is where people get to ask questions to either the president or the press secretary.
Yes.
And the pool is, what's the pool?
So the pool is basically born out of the idea that there are going to be events that have space limitations. So whether it's signing an executive order in the Oval Office, giving an address in the Roosevelt Room, or doing a joint presser in the diplomatic room, you can't fit the entire White House press corps in those spaces. There's, I mean, probably thousands of people who cover the White House on some temporary basis. In the Oval Office, you can maybe fit like 30. So they have a rotating press pool, meaning on any given day, you might be what's called the pooler for different segments of the media. So there's a print pooler, TV, radio. They're adding a new media pooler now. That's a new development from the White House. And the White House Correspondents Association decides who's in the pool and what the rotation is. So when the president's doing events that are not open to the full press, the pool's there to report on what's happening, and they send a report to the rest of the press. And then later on, the White House copies that report, sends it out to their media list so that they can stay informed on basically what's happening when they're not in the room.
So WHCA basically acts as gatekeepers for this whole process. Now let's explain who are the people who are part of WHCA.
Yeah, so the WHCA is mostly made up of, on its board, legacy corporate media members. Washington Post, New York Times, Politico, CNN. There's one Fox News person on it now. And they get to decide the seating arrangement in the briefing room. So when you see on TV that the first row is all of the people who have TV cameras with them and microphones, whether it's Peter Doocy, Caitlin Collins, Peter Alexander, those people are all assigned those seats. It's not first come, first serve. They have that seat every single time there's a briefing. And basically the first 3 rows are made up of corporate legacy media. The back 2 rows are sort of still at the discretion of the WHCA. They throw a few conservative outlets in there
Just
to kind of pretend that they're being unbiased. But typically in the back row, and typically as well, you have to share that seat with a number of other outlets. So right now, the Daily Caller is on a rotation with, I think, 5 other outlets. So we only get the seat 1 day a week. If there's no briefing on the day that we're assigned to the seat, too bad, so sad. You don't get to ask a question on the other days unless you're standing in the aisle and the press secretary decides to call on you, which was a huge problem under the Biden administration, by the way, because Karine Jean-Pierre, the press secretary during the second half, apparently had a policy that she would not call on people who did not have an assigned seat.
Interesting. And that kind of like brings in the question of like some people stand in the aisles, and I think she did not even take questions from people who were standing in the aisles.
That's right.
So now let's bring up to the news, which is the White House is taking that power back into their own hands.
Yes, the White House is now taking control of the pool. They haven't made any changes to the briefing room situation, although Caroline Leavitt does take questions from the aisles now, which is great, as it should be. If you're in the room, you should have equal opportunity to get to ask a question. But they've taken over the pool. So they said that they're going to decide which outlets get to go into the Oval Office or whatever other room or trip with the president on any given day. And they're going to handle the rotation and sending out the reports. And the WHCA was apoplectic over this idea. How dare you take this power away from us? And I will say the ideal situation is probably the two of them working in concert and coming to some kind of compromise, because I think it's fair to say if there were a Democratic administration in power, conservative media would not be thrilled about the idea of Biden wanting to control who gets to cover him. That is sort of antithetical to the idea of a free press, but the WHCA has been so derelict in its duty and so biased in which outlets it decides to give access to that it's reasonable for the Trump White House to say, you have failed in this basic assignment, and so now we're going to run the show.
I mean, you brought up the obvious critique of what that could have been. So, I mean, right now, White House wanting new media in there, right now, White House doing this. Is it fair to say that this is happening because they realize that the all things new media and podcasting world leaned heavily towards the right and helped them push across the finish line?
I'm sure that's part of it. I mean, Trump was hugely popular on a lot of major podcasts, whether it was Joe Rogan, Theo Von, Nelk Boys, whatever else. And that was largely credited with helping him not only win the election, but really retake culture.
Yeah.
And so they want to be able to still access the people who listen to those platforms. And one way to do that is to have that new media seat in the briefing room. And I think it's important to mention here that the reason they're able to do that without taking control of the briefing room from the WHCA is because there are 5 seats off to the left of the podium when you're facing the podium. And those seats are typically reserved for members of the White House staff. They're usually deputy communications director, whoever's working directly under the press secretary. And they've said, we're going to actually reserve 2 of those seats for members of the new media. You can apply for the seat and we'll bring all of the applicants in on any given day.
You mentioned culture in there. How would you, during 2016, it was so obvious what is culture and what is counterculture, right? So counterculture, it felt like what Barstool was doing back in the day, what Daily Caller was doing back in the day. And culture was all things resistance lib, which is kind of ironical because Trump was in the White House. However, this time around, it felt like, it's not that risque to touch a MAGA hat. If you had to decide, kind of draw those lines of culture and counterculture and how that will change come this year and Trump circa 2024, what are those lines?
It's difficult because I still don't think that Trumpism, MAGA, whatever you want to call it, is the dominant culture.
Yeah.
But it's taken an increasing share of the pie.
Okay.
So the lines are a little bit blurry right now. But it is interesting to see athletes doing the Trump dance or people posting memes of things that Trump has said and not getting canceled for it. I mean, celebrities can post pictures with the president and not have their lives ruined. That seems like a pretty big shift to me from
Kim
where we were
Kardashian
at.
posted Melania with that hat situation.
Exactly. I mean, if you did that in 16, I mean,
Donzo.
You'd have to cancel your Instagram
Yeah.
account.
This time it's kind of does feel different, and however, I think I'm scared about all things MAGA overreading the mandate because it's so obvious what that chasm looks like. Because tell me if you disagree with this read, which is Trumpism is right now, all this right-wing bohemian tech bro vibe, and then there is the Steve Bannon vibe.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and I think that's going to be one of the big stories of the second Trump admin is the tension between the more libertarian sentiments of tech world versus the populism of the traditional Trump base.
Yeah.
And we already saw that play out
during the immigration thing.
Exactly, because you had Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy calling for an expansion of the H-1B visa program. And a lot of Trump supporters were furious because they felt betrayed by these people who they brought into the fold really in good faith and felt like they were starting to quote unquote get it.
Yeah.
And then when they started talking about an expansion of the immigration system, which, I mean, for those who aren't familiar, one of the tenets of Trump's America First policy, or at least the one adopted by his supporters, is that American workers should get priority, and we should be starting at home to fill open jobs, to train people to fill tech positions in particular. And when you start talking about bringing people in from other countries by the order of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, well, what happens to the people who went to American university, got a STEM degree, and can't find work?
Let's talk about the get it factor. Like, if you had to talk to the quote unquote libertarian aspect of like the Trump faction, what are they not getting? Or what is that something that they should get?
There's massive resentment among the American people for the way that they feel they've been sold out by their political leaders. Part of that is offshoring the manufacturing base. Going back to the 90s, opening up trade with China, creating a business environment where so-called American companies could have their headquarters or their labor sources coming from countries where labor is significantly cheaper, and effectively pricing out the American worker, who has all of these labor protections, higher wages, and thus is more expensive for a company to have employed in large numbers. That was part of it. Selling out the American people by spending a lot of taxpayer money and a lot of American lives in getting involved in foreign conflicts that weren't directly related to American security, and selling out the American people through illegal immigration. I mean, the idea that New York is opening up 4-star hotels to illegal migrants when you have a homeless veteran sitting down the street.
I live a block away from Roosevelt, by the way.
Do you?
Yeah.
They're shutting it down.
I know it's different now. Like, literally 3 months ago, it was chaotic. It was, I don't know, man. I have such a hard time thinking about it because I don't blame these people. First of all, like, maybe some of them, I don't know, but like it was impossible to get on the train and not see a Hispanic lady with her child tied to her back, and she's selling secondhand like Mentos and Orbit and whatever.
Yeah.
I was like, what the fuck is going on? This is just like sad to look at.
It is sad. And if you're in the DC area, if you've ever ordered DoorDash,
Oh yeah.
I mean, your DoorDasher profile says that you're having some random woman come to your house, and then who actually shows up? A Venezuelan on a moped. And the worst part of it that people don't realize is, like, okay, the mopeds are crazy drivers. They get in accidents all the time. They're constantly hitting people. And you'll see them, like, if you walk a block from where we are right now, you'll see probably like
Huddled.
20 to 100 mopeds just waiting to pick up orders. Which is like, okay, cool, make your money if you pay taxes on it and you're here legally to work. But I was talking to someone about a year ago, Joshua Trevino. He works for Texas Public Policy Foundation. He's an immigration expert. And he said, what people don't realize about the border is it's not just random groups coming across. The cartel on the southern side is completely in control of who gets to go into America, and you have to pay to play. So if you're an illegal immigrant who wants to come into the U.S., you pay the cartel through a coyote $10,000, $20,000.
Can you explain what a coyote is?
Yeah, a coyote is a human trafficker, effectively. They usually work for the cartel, and their job is to find gaps in border patrol so that you can get into the U.S. without getting arrested. And for people who can't pay up front, they have to work in the U.S. and send the money that they make back to the cartel. So all these DoorDash drivers, all the moped people, the woman selling the Mentos and the Orbit gum are probably sending almost every single dollar they make back to the cartels in Mexico to pay off their bill for being able to get into the U.S.
That we talk a lot about fake news. We talk a lot about misinformation. And when misinformation as a term was brought up, it was usually in context to all things COVID or election fraud, whatever. However, this was one of the bigger misinformation in my end. And as someone who is an immigrant, I genuinely felt upset that there was such a lack of reporting regarding what was happening in the border. What was that illusion from like mainstream media's end in denying that was happening? Because the numbers are crazy. Like, depends on who you ask, it's somewhere between 10, 15, 20 million. Why was there so much denial until Trump's election?
Well, if you think about it in the frame of illegal immigration is good for corporations because they can get cheap labor. and this was reported by the New York Times, by the way, that companies like Kellogg's and other massive food conglomerates and other corporations in the U.S. were employing minor illegal immigrants, so basically child slave labor, because they didn't have to pay them very much money and it was all under the table. And then look at the fact that a lot of these news outlets are owned by mega corporations or billionaires who have companies that engage in these practices. It's often the editorial line to soften the realities of illegal immigration. But the two prevailing narratives were sort of the classic, I would say it's like a classic leftist tactic, which is it's not happening, to it is happening and it's good that it's happening. That's sort of the direction that they follow.
Yeah.
And that was what we saw with the Biden border crisis. For the first 2 years, it was, it's not happening. And then it became, well, it might be happening, but it's good that it's happening because these people are just trying to get a better life. They're just trying to take advantage of America's massive resources and economy because they're so destitute, they have no other choice. And so we need to welcome them with open arms and take care of them because that's their only option.
Not just that, if that stops, then you will have a labor shortage. That was
Yes,
baked
exactly.
in,
They said the economy was going to blow up if you either shut down the border or start deportations. And my response to that is if you have a labor shortage, then isn't that the greatest opportunity if you're a progressive who believes in fair wages for workers, great labor protections, the ability of Americans to shop around for jobs and leverage their labor. This is the greatest moment for those people to be able to do that. But you effectively destroy that opportunity when you import millions of people who are willing to work for less money.
So let's extend that argument right now. So if you are saying that potentially if there is a labor shortage, if Trump gets around with limiting people coming from the border illegally, that is an opportunity for
better conditions for American workers.
And basically fleshing out the working class again.
Yes, exactly. I mean, if you go to a place like Detroit or a lot of towns in Ohio or in Kentucky, there's a lot of people who left the labor market. So I don't even think the unemployment rate is really that reflective of the American workforce right now because a lot of people left after the 2008 recession, started to come back a little bit towards the end of Obama's second term and during the first Trump administration, then got kicked out again during the pandemic. And a lot of them never came back from that. They just decided that it was easier, a better option for them to not work and take whatever government, safety net they possibly could because they couldn't compete with the cheap labor that was coming in. So it's a combination of increasing wages for American workers by nature of companies having to attract talent with more money and also more people that have left the labor market during the pandemic coming back into the fold.
You want to talk about something fun now?
Yeah.
You want to shit on the right now?
Let's do it.
Okay. I've been thinking about something, which is, tell me what you think about this headline. The incoherent sexual politics of the right.
Okay, tell me more.
So when all things Elon Musk and Ashley St. Clair was happening, there was this refusal to admit that there is something weird about all of this.
Yes.
Vis-a-vis basically being a polygamist and having this weird fetish of basically populating the whole earth with your own kids. Maybe it's noble cause to want more kids. I don't know. But however, going around basically not taking care of kids who you are responsible for is also weird. So the obvious juxtaposition is that, conservatism is the family values party and all of that, and you guys are basically being ran rampant by this guy who's not taking responsibility for his own kid, and also, by the way, doesn't give a shit about any of the trad stuff, and it basically gave Ashley basically reality check on what Barstool conservatism looks like.
Yeah, so we talked earlier about the fault line on immigration between the libertarian tech bros and the populist right.
Okay.
There's another fault line.
Okay, let's do it.
In Republican politics or conservatism, which is between the Barstool conservatives and the trad conservatives.
Okay.
And they are very diametrically opposed on a lot of cultural issues. The Barstool conservatives culturally are sick of wokeism. They like free speech.
They hate pronouns.
All of that
all
stuff.
All that stuff, yeah.
But on things like IVF, gay marriage, surrogacy, they're fine with all of that.
Yeah.
Then there's the more traditional
I'm
conservative
guessing
side.
that pisses you off. Yeah, okay.
I don't even say
you can say that.
Pisses me off. I mean, they're entitled to their opinion. I'm very Catholic, so you can probably guess where I stand on this. But then there's the traditional conservative side that has a lot of really deep skepticism about advancements in technology and how they impact sort of the human condition and the human experience.
Okay.
And thinks that a lot of these new unregulated ways that people are starting and having families have really deep implications for exactly what we're talking about, which is the nuclear family, raising a healthy, successful child, and having a happy, productive, successful next generation.
Before we talk about Elon and all things, what happened then, let's talk more about that skepticism. I'm going to explain what Barstool conservatism is, which is basically not being conservative and more about a reactionary faction of the right, which is saying that we are tired of all things wokeism.
Yeah.
That's the argument. For the trad right, let's call it the J.D. Vance right.
Sure.
It's a pro-family argument, which is that it all centers around the family. And let's talk about how Elon Musk and what happened during that news cycle was not part of that.
Well, there's also like an interesting thing here that I think I have to mention, which is that Elon Musk's approach to family, in quotes, family in like heavy quotes,
okay,
is very similar to what has been talked about by people like Andrew Tate and manosphere influencers, which is they think that birth rates declining is such a immense crisis, which actually the trad right agrees with.
Yeah.
But they view the solution to that as
being Genghis Khan.
Yeah. A conqueror, sowing your wild oats, having as many kids with as many women as possible to repopulate the earth. And the trad right would respond to that by saying people need to have more children, but they need to do it in a traditional family unit for the purpose of having, again, the most successful
so the child has a normal, exactly. So talk to me about like what should the right's response to making sure that that faction, which is the Barstool libertarian types, gets acclimated within the, let's say, the conservative tent.
Well, for one
what's
thing,
the pathway there?
For one thing, Elon Musk's role in the administration should be limited to cutting government waste,
doing your job,
deregulating the business environment,
yeah,
and not getting too much into the cultural issues for fear of pissing off the trad or pro-life right.
Yeah.
But I think Trump has actually threaded the needle pretty well. I mean, speaking personally, I was not thrilled with the IVF order, as you can probably guess, but on the abortion issue, he effectively nullified it for the left by promising that he would never sign a federal abortion ban and that he was going to leave the issue up to the states. And from a pro-life perspective, there's been a lot of debates about what some conservatives call Pro-Life Inc.,
okay,
which is this massive infrastructure of pro-life nonprofits and activist groups who have been for a long time lobbying for the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which they successfully did. And now they want to offload that responsibility to the president to then sign a federal abortion ban. And the counter argument to them is you now have abortion back on the state level, which is what you lobbied for, you argued for with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, because that is what that would mean. And so now you need to do the groundwork, the grassroots activism on the state level to encourage pro-life legislation closer to the people.
Do you think so? A lot of people would say that Trump going that direction, which is a lot more vanilla on pro-life stuff, kind of took the wind out of the sails from all the logic, which basically was the reason why Republicans lost the midterms. And the left did not have that argument on their side.
I think that's exactly right. because anytime Kamala Harris or one of her surrogates would fearmonger about abortion heading up to the election, you had on-camera statements from Trump saying very explicitly, I'm not going to touch the abortion issue when I'm president. And even J.D. Vance said if a pro-life bill or a national abortion ban ended up on the president's desk, he would veto it. And that's from someone who was probably one of the most pro-life Republican politicians in the Republican caucus.
That being JD.
On a personal level.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a lot of moving of the goalposts from the left on the issue because of that. And one of the fascinating elements of that I saw was, for the left, abortion became less about the young unmarried woman who's in college and has an unplanned pregnancy, and it actually became about women who are married and already have kids. So there were a lot of stories in the lead up to the election about miscarriage care, about fetal abnormalities, and you saw women next to their husbands in ads talking about how they believed that the Dobbs decision put their lives in danger because they weren't able to access quote-unquote abortion care so that they could choose the size of their family or when they wanted to have their next kid, as opposed to it really previously being about, again, the unplanned early in their life pregnancy for a young woman who feels like it's going to destroy her future.
That's the moving of the goalposts, basically. Tying a loop on the whole sexual dynamics and the battle of the sexes part of all the election cycle. Leading up to last year, there was this lot of conversation about the Andrew Tate faction of the right and how there was this huge debate among what it means to be, and I even cringe saying it out loud, high quality man and high quality woman, whatever. And the whole debate became around how the online right saw women and what there was this downstream effect, which, I mean, I'm 28. I was quote unquote going on dates during that time, and the whole dynamic became so awkward. And I remember you reacting to, I think it was on Tim Pool. You were not on Tim Pool. I think Tim Pool said something along the lines of, oh, if high quality men have a responsibility now to basically say no to women because they have slept with too many dudes or whatever. I mean, you're married now, so you're out of the market and the awesomeness that is the dating pool these days.
Thank God.
Yeah. What do you make of how, like, men and women, especially online men and women, view each other?
It seems like there's an inherent skepticism.
Okay.
Between the two sexes.
Yeah.
Where they're constantly questioning each other's motivations. And this is in concert with the fact that young women are becoming more liberal and young men are becoming more conservative.
Yeah.
So there's not only the cultural divide, but also the political divide among people who are entering the dating pool. And I don't see that leading anywhere good.
Yeah.
Especially as we're talking about birth rates
Yeah.
and marriage rates and the creation of families. But I don't feel supremely qualified to talk about what the answer to that is. But I would say, just from my experience being married, and I've been with my husband, not married, but with him for 3 or 4 years now. Part of it's just being normal, and part of it is, I think, treating each other with a lot of grace. And I don't think there's much grace in dating anymore. No, it seems like people...
What is a high quality man and a woman? Can you
I mean, I can give you like the Catholic perspective.
Let's hear that.
Okay, so a high quality man is someone who's able to lead his household in the faith dimension.
Okay.
It's someone who is a protector and a provider, and who is basically... So there's a lot of confusion around biblical writings about what it means to be submissive to your husband.
Okay.
And people who are irreligious tend to view it as the wife does everything the husband says. And it's a lot more complimentary than that. So we would certainly view the husband as being the leader of the home, but that doesn't mean that the wife doesn't have a voice or has to do everything her husband says, especially if it's not in keeping with what
she wants.
No, actually, no, not at all. In a marriage, you have to suppress your personal desires a lot for the other person.
Okay.
But it's more about like if your husband's doing something that's not in keeping with your faith tradition or otherwise doing things that are harmful for your family, like you're not obligated to follow that. So you have to use your judgment as well. And then the woman, a good quality, going back to high quality woman.
Yeah.
I think it's someone who is willing to sometimes take a back seat when necessary in order to allow her husband to be the masculine leader and provider that he's supposed to be in the home. It's being a good mother. I'm not at that stage yet, but...
Does it say anything about what kind of car this high-quality man drives?
No. It's none of this. It's not income. It's not cars. It's not what kind of house he can buy you. What
so
kind
I think like in the
engagement ring. None of that.
In the dating market, and you see clips of this online all the time, which is basically defining what a high-quality man is based on,
6'2", $150,000 a year.
So what does that do to, and I think like that was one of the bigger reasons. And by the way, there's no blame to the woman, by the way. I'm just saying like because of that content and that culture, I think that was the biggest driving force because of the whole men going right, if you ask me, because they felt like from a cultural standpoint, there is so much pressure on them being all of these things.
And like nothing was good enough.
Nothing was good enough.
And I was going to talk about this earlier before you asked me about high quality men and women, because what I experienced in the dating world before I got married was, with whether it's my girlfriends who were seeing guys or my guys who were seeing girls, they would cut and run at like the slightest inconvenience or if there was one thing that wasn't on their checklist.
Oh, we shitting on women now? Let's do it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
cool.
let's. Well, they'll be like, yeah, he's wonderful and like we had so much fun, but he's kind of short or
no. Well,
I don't really like the
out.
way that he dresses.
Okay.
And it seems like they just have a really unrealistic idea of, one, what's important actually in a long-term partnership, and two, like what they can achieve.
Oh, we're really shitting on women. Oh, okay.
I mean, okay. Like if you watch these online videos, like you ask women to rate themselves.
Yeah. Oh boy.
Oof. And
I can't say that, so I'll let you.
I'll go. Yeah, it's fine. And you hear their answers, and you're like, "Girl, you're delusional." And then they talk about what they're looking for in a partner, and you're like, "You're never gonna find that because you're not at that level."
As someone who's online all the time, I think the scientific term for that is called hoflation.
Hoflation?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to really get into this, we have to talk about hookup culture.
Let's get into that.
Because I think that's a huge driver of a lot of these disparities, which is that the really high quality men that we're talking about don't want to marry someone who has had their hoe face in college and now wants to settle down because it's like used goods or whatever like the common manosphere terms are, but because do you want to be the guy who is enough of a sucker to be the first person that she wants to settle down with when she decides she's ready. And she's already done all of these crazy things that were for her own benefit.
Yeah.
Like, is that really the person who is prepared for the sacrifices of marriage and setting aside personal desires for motherhood? And I see a lot of marriages that struggle because, like, the woman doesn't want to give up a really high-powered career or even a not high-powered career. Like, you see a lot of women who, so anecdote time, because I was on the plane down to Florida last weekend, and I was sitting next to this woman who was a government worker, and she had an N95 mask on.
Oh, boy.
Stereotypes abound. But she was telling me how I'm not going to say which department, because she was actually very nice, but needless to say, we had a lot of value differences. And she was talking about how her and her husband had like a 13-year-old daughter, and she did not want to give up her career in the government, so she had an au pair for her one child. And that whole concept was so bizarre to me. Like, you have one kid, and if you can't handle like working and having one kid to the point you have to have a person staying in your house to raise your kid for you, like, shouldn't that be a sign to you that maybe you need to like back off? The concept is bizarre to me. But I think sometimes, like, one of the reasons divorce rates are so high is that people get into these relationships where they don't talk about those really deep issues before they get married, and then the hard things come along and they realize their values are really disparate from one another.
Yeah.
And when the rubber meets the road and you have to make those decisions, if you're not on the same page from the jump, it's going to be really, really difficult.
I love that au pair example so much because in New York it's super common, by the way. Because everybody's working all the time.
Right.
And I was at this house, and I think the wife was some sort of like art director, management guy, and the guy was like a finance guy, like classic East Coast couple type.
Yeah.
And
so the thing is they could totally live on one income.
Yeah, they can totally live on one income. And the point is, like, and the child came out, and he kind of had a little, his English was like, you can tell like he's just learning how to speak. However, his English had like a minor Hispanic twang to it. And I was like, what is going on like right now? And I didn't want to question it on the spot. And eventually the au pair comes out, and she is obviously someone who's Hispanic. And I was like, yeah, there's something wrong.
Yeah, and then you compare that to the video of young Baron, and he has Melania's accent. And like, whatever you want to say.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah,
whatever you want to say about the Trump family and how involved Trump necessarily was, or how he like stepped out on Melania, that woman was obviously raising her own son. And one of the things that radicalized me a lot in the past couple of years, I'm going to give a shout out here because I listened to Alex Clark's podcast a lot, back when it was called, what was it called?
Our Turning Point Yesterday?
The Spillover.
Yeah.
And she had a guest on who was talking about research related to the early years of child formation, specifically the first 3 years of a child's life, and the impacts that daycare can have on that.
Interesting.
And there is a very heavy correlation between a child being in daycare for the first 3 years of their life and ADHD, separation anxiety, and other effectively personality disorders, because the child does not get enough attention from the parental unit in the first 3 years. Later in life, they tend to act out for attention in negative ways. And I thought that was really fascinating, and something that I really took for granted, which was the idea that you can just like drop your kid off with a nanny or at a daycare and you pick them up at the end of the day and everything's fine. Like, no, you're actually causing a deep wound to that child.
Let's empathize with the default 23-year-old girl who's graduating out of school and stepping into work. Okay, so this lady has aspirations regarding having a career, having a stable job, and wants to do something as an ambition. However, she also wants to be a mom and be married to someone and have a successful family unit. She has student loans. She wants to pay off those loans and get a job. What's your message to that girl?
I think it's okay to work for a period of time, but when you have a kid, you have to make a decision. I don't buy into the theory that women can have it all.
Oh, boy.
Sorry. What does Sheryl Sandberg say? Lean in.
Lean in,
You gotta lean the fuck out.
Yeah.
That's stolen from Ali Wong. She did a bit on that in one of her comedy specials, but I loved it. I just don't think you can do both to your full potential. You can do both halfway.
Yeah.
But you can't do both fully. And actually, I really like Megyn Kelly.
Okay.
But I am going to criticize her a bit here because she sent a tweet out in the last week or two about this exact issue, about how you can achieve the pinnacle of career success while having kids at home. And she's like, you know what? I did it, and you can too. for some people, that's the case. But keep in mind, Megyn Kelly was probably making millions of dollars a year on her Fox show, had a husband who had a really powerful career. They lived in New York. And I can't say 100% that she had help, but I'd find it very, very shocking if she didn't. And that's simply not the reality for most women. That's a very small subset, like the top 1% of women who can make that much money and afford to have the kind of help that they need to raise 2-3 kids. And you also have to think about the impacts on your children when you make that choice. So the more realistic argument, I think, is pushing back on the feminist idea that if you leave the workforce for a period of time to raise your kids and then you want to go back in, that you're not going to be able to do it because you have too much of a gap in your career history. Your resume has this empty spot in the middle from when you were raising your kids, and now you're going to be going into a lower job at a lower pay. But again, that's a sacrifice that you have to make if you want what's best for your family. And as sympathetic as I am to the idea that women want to have careers, I just feel a little bit confused by the idea that that's more important than your literal offspring.
You're confused by the fact that basically you're saying that you should prioritize the latter for the former.
That's how I feel.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't blame the 20-something girl who's coming up.
No, well, they've been messaged this.
So the whole Sheryl Sandberg messaging.
Well, especially for millennials.
Yeah.
If you go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, that was when the girl boss narrative was becoming incredibly popular.
Girls, the show on HBO?
Yes.
That was responsible for basically all
before that.
But when I was coming in school, all
Yeah.
the girls wanted to
Yes.
be that way because of
Yes.
that show.
Yeah.
And everything that came with it.
Sex in the City,
Yeah.
all of that stuff. Friends. Nobody on Friends had kids. and it was all, Rachel's going to be this big fashion designer. And
Yeah.
I don't know what Monica did, but there was a lot of cultural messaging and also messaging in education
Yeah.
where women and men were treated like they were exactly the same. And I think that messed up a lot of women to desire the wrong things.
Did that mess you up?
For some time, it did.
How did it mess you up?
Well, I didn't get married till I was 29.
Even though you
and I don't
wanted
have
to?
kids yet. Yeah.
Okay.
And
When did you actually basically came to terms with what you wanted?
25 or 26.
Before that, you were in this like nebulous area where you wanted to just go all out in your career. And
Yeah, and I always had this idea that I wanted to be married, but I didn't really know what I needed to do to achieve it. I thought it was something that just kind of happened,
Yeah.
and that it would happen when it was supposed to. And the idea of stepping aside from my burgeoning career at that time was really scary to me. And now it's like whatever.
I think, and this might sound super, I don't know, obvious, but I think a really good solution is having a good partner in this process, because sometimes, more often than not, my mom, and I come from like an Indian family, so we're all about tradition and all that stuff. My mom was a math teacher, and when I was born, she really wanted to be a mom. And my dad was going through a lawsuit. We needed the money, right? And my mom was like, I'm going to go back to school. But my dad was like, I know that you want to be a mom, so be a mom. And he basically worked overtime, figured out that time of his life. We got out of that lawsuit. And when I was able to walk and talk, my mom basically still wanted to be at the house. So she started tutoring. And now she runs a tutoring business, which makes more money than my dad does. So I grew around that environment. When my dad was leaving for work, my mom would make him breakfast. And when my dad would come back from work, he would see my mom teaching, and he would cook her dinner. So that's the osmosis which happened around me. And that's my version of feminism, which is basically running the family to some extent, and also being a girl boss.
In a different way than what is conceptualized in popular culture. And this kind of brings us full circle back to what is a high-quality man and a high-quality woman. Those things matter way more when you're in a long-term partnership than the videos asking women, what kind of car does the guy have to drive in order for you to even consider going out?
What
with him?
should like a guy do to basically let a girl feel comfortable in making sure that it is okay for her to prioritize this over that? Because more often than not, the guy reaction, and this is where I can talk about it, is that automatically I'm gonna step back and let you make this decision because I don't want to be the guy to tell you to stop going to office.
But that should be worked out like way before you're at that point. Like
It
the
doesn't,
decision
by the way, for most people.
Yeah, I know, and that's sad because that plan or decision should be agreed upon way before you have kids and frankly before you get married. I don't know. I mean, our dating history was kind of unconventional because we went on 2 dates and then my dad passed away really suddenly. And so we were basically forced to get really deep really quickly because I was grieving pretty immensely for probably the first year of our relationship. So it sort of fast-tracked the process to, like, okay, this guy's going to be there for me no matter what. And that was what made me really comfortable with my husband. But that was forced upon us.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how you create that situation organically.
But I think there's a duty to talk about that from
Agreed.
the jump.
And one of the things that I was talking earlier about how I thought marriage just kind of happened and it wasn't something that I could achieve. Like there weren't things that I could do to get married besides going on dates. But my perspective on that changed a lot in the last year that I was dating before I met my husband. I sort of went in with this idea of radical honesty. And on every first date that I went on, I was very clear about what I wanted in a relationship and what my expectations were.
Yeah.
And my husband will tell you this. On our first date, I told him, I'm Catholic. I want to get married in the church. I'm dating to get married, and I want to have kids. And I want to raise the kids myself. And there's no, like, wiggle room around that. There's no, like, negotiation on the things that are important to me.
Uh-huh.
And I think making that very clear from the jump allowed the person that I was seeing to either decide that that wasn't for them, or if they weren't sure yet, they could come to terms with that or get comfortable with it. And if they agreed with me, then perfect. Like maybe we're a good match.
It's kind of like a trial by fire.
Mm-hmm.
From like a guy point of view, and this might sound like a pushback, even though it's not, when a girl comes and like has those quote unquote lists of things that they want, a guy might feel like I could be anyone. I'm a placeholder boyfriend. Like I couldn't, like she has these demands. As long as someone fits said demands, it doesn't really matter who the guy is.
I guess you're justified in feeling that way.
Yeah.
Your feelings are valid.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Amber.
You're
yeah.
welcome.
Yeah.
I guess I don't really view it that way.
Yeah.
Because why would you be dating at that point if that were the case?
That's fair.
Yeah, because the idea that this woman you're on a date with couldn't have found some guy who wanted to marry her and have kids yet doesn't seem super realistic to me.
Well, this was fun.
It was fun.
It was
we got
awesome.
deep.
We got deep. Well, give me.
I wasn't expecting
I know.
the interview to go that
Yeah,
direction.
I'm glad it did, though. Last question to end it. I'm super stoked and grateful that I met you when I moved to the city because your show was the first show I had produced in journalism.
Wow.
So that meant a lot. So I've seen you through various stages of your career
And life.
It's probably an open-ended question. What makes you feel proud of having gone through that chapter? You were canceled. You were single. You're married. You have a job. You didn't have a job. You're figuring out your life in like political journalism in general, and now you are way stronger than you came out on the other side. When you look back on that chapter, what goes to your head?
I'm very proud of my resilience. And I always knew that I was strong. My parents raised me that way.
Yeah.
One of the stories I like to tell is when I was in elementary school, there was this kid that was picking on me.
Yeah.
My dad said, next time you just punch him right in the nose.
Oh, boy. Nice.
Yeah, I never did.
That's a
but
plumber thing to say.
yeah,
Awesome. Yeah.
He was like, I don't care what the consequences are. You need to stand up for yourself. And when I look back at all of the shit that I've been through over the past almost 10 years now in journalism,
Yeah.
I feel like no matter what came, I tried to handle everything with grace and always come out the other side stronger. And a lot of it has coincided with my journey back to Catholicism because I was away from the church for some time. And now I really feel like a lot of it was part of God's plan and sort of trusting in better things being on the other side. And I'm just very grateful to have landed where I'm at today.
Can I say one thing? And it's
Yeah.
I'm sorry if it sounds corny.
No, it's okay.
I liked you when I met you, and I really wanted to work with you. Not because of like, besides the work itself. When I first moved to the city, I was Baroque, obviously, and I was sleeping in the office. I was sleeping in other people's couches. And when I used to go out in like the DC circles, everybody was fucking loaded or comes from money. That's why their parents can basically allow their kid to basically have a $25,000 job in
That's
DC,
right.
and that's the class. So I could never relate to anyone in a level, but when I learned about all of this, like that, even though you went to Georgetown, you came from this background, I was like, oh, okay, cool. Someone's there who's like a normal person. So I was like, I might become friends with her. So I don't know, like there's no point there, but I remembered that vividly.
Well, that's really cool. And, as much as the left talks about representation
Yeah.
in media,
I'm glad you represented, Amber.
there's something to be said for representation of different classes of people and
Yeah,
different
because that's the main
backgrounds.
distinction, class.
Right.
Thanks, Amber.
Thank you.